Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? As if we wait much longer with the post-lunch lull that invariably occurs, I could lose half of you to some sort of nap-like activity before we even get started. So yes, thank you for coming, both in person and online, as it looks like we've got both some virtual attendees and folks in the room here. So it's nice to have an opportunity to share with all of you the ongoing work that we've been doing on the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. This is our, we just finished our 4th year of a project to enhance ESIP's Data Management Training Clearinghouse, and our focus today is providing an opportunity to see what the new system looks like and have a chance to actually interact with it and provide us some feedback as we go through the final stage of sort of doing the sort of the final house cleaning. You think of it as, you do a major home renovation project and you finally have to, blow the dust off the shelves and sweep the floors and finally start using it. And that's where we are pretty much in the clearinghouse. We have a number of resources available for our participation in the workshop this afternoon. We have our shared document that is also linked through the Kiko chat. So that's a place where you can follow along with the information and also have available the links to the development version of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. We have our agenda that is right here that provides an outline of what we're going to be covering over the next 3 hours. And yes, there will be a break, as otherwise it would be somewhat deadly, actually. And so and as I said, we're going to be going through a combination of brief introductory presentations and then demonstrations of the clearinghouse, and then opportunities for you to actually interact with the clearinghouse yourself, familiarize yourself with its capabilities, and be able to both gain that familiarity, but also provide us feedback, because this has been one of the key objectives of the presentations that we've provided over the past several years, in terms of being able to get feedback and then integrate that into the ongoing development of the platform. Here's the link to the notes page that we're working in right now. The slides are also linked off of the shared notes document, so if you want to follow along or visit the presentation later, as there are a lot of links included in the presentation that you might find useful in the future. And then we're going to start working on the workshop itself. So, and then we're going to finish it up with some discussion of what our takeaways from our conversation about the clearinghouse are, in terms of being able to, again, inform what we're looking at as the final stages of the development of the new clearinghouse, so that we will be able to then release it as the new operational Data Management Training Clearinghouse later this fall. And with that, feel free to add some notes to the shared notes document. We also will have, let's see, do we have the links?
Links to the feedback?
Let's see.
What are you looking for, Carl? The links to the feedback are on our notes page.
On our notes page. So this is the one here. So from that, we've got 2 layers of notes pages. So this is our notes page that also has the agenda, and it also has some login information that you can use when we start to go through the demonstration. This is where you can provide some shared notes and feedback, some information related to you can, of course, look for any resources that you'd like as we go through our exploration of the Clearinghouse, but we also have some suggested resources if you want to do some targeted work with the Clearinghouse. And at the bottom of this, we have a workshop evaluation link, and then another form that we've been using for capturing feedback on the Clearinghouse itself, so that we can combine that information, bring it together, and integrate it into our development roadmap. And then also an interest survey, because we will also be finishing up the workshop with an ask of those of you here in person and virtually to see if there may be an opportunity for you to engage with us in the ongoing work of the Clearinghouse beyond the life of the funded project that we're working on now, as we continue to work on continuing to develop the Clearinghouse as a community activity in which the community contributes information about learning resources, the community participates in the curation and documentation process, and the community potentially participates through using the resources that are in the Clearinghouse and providing feedback on those resources to help us continue to essentially evolve the content and capabilities of the Clearinghouse through time. We also have links to 3 GitHub repositories. So if you're a GitHub user and you would like to also provide either issues, or if you want to dive deep and actually look at our code and content in GitHub, you can also do that through the GitHub repositories through issues or pull requests. And those links are all provided here at the bottom of our shared notes document. So with that, unless you'd like to add anything, Nancy?
The only thing is, in terms of sign in, I'm gonna delete the please sign in on our notes, because you can all sign in through the ESIP notes to make it more clear. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to dive in to the initial presentation, and then I will pass the torch to Nancy for our first presentation and demonstration of the capabilities of the Clearinghouse. And we're going to tag team this virtually and in person as we take on different parts of the functionality of the Clearinghouse. So I'll go ahead and go into slideshow mode here. And now this is causing issues. So yes, the Data Management Training Clearinghouse, I've told you, really what we're looking to do as we're engaging with the ESIP community here. This is the point in the project where we've been at this for 4 years. And we're on the home stretch. We're in our second no-cost extension for those of you in the grant-funded project world. The pandemic has, and other factors have made it essential, really, to be able to stretch out what started out as a 3-year project to a slightly longer timeline. And we've already talked about the notes document, and we'll be using the demo accounts that are in that notes document in just a few minutes. And we will be taking a break at about 3:25 to stretch and move some blood. And other than that, we're going to focus on the latest snapshot of where the Data Management Training Clearinghouse is. For those of you who might have attended some of our DMTC workshops over the last several years, each one has incrementally presented a new set of capabilities that we've both been able to demonstrate and then get feedback on, and then iterate as we look at that feedback and try to integrate it into the continued development of the platform as we move forward. So today we're essentially going to be going through the full package of capabilities that we originally envisioned at the beginning of the project, as each of our previous presentations has incrementally moved towards that full package. And as I said, we're going to be having an opportunity to work hands-on with the exploration of the information content in the clearinghouse, the search interface, and the tools for providing user feedback on the learning resources that are in the data management training clearinghouse, and also the submission and editing components in the clearinghouse. So you can sort of see what the whole package is, and now what a submission workflow looks like for being able to contribute and edit and curate and ultimately publish metadata related to learning resources that the clearinghouse is providing access to. So again, this is our agenda. It's also in the notes, so I won't belabor it. And as I said, Nancy and I will be tag teaming the different sections of the presentation as we go through the afternoon. See if I can advance here. So starting with just a little bit of background. The Data Management Training Clearinghouse has actually been in existence since 2016. With the work starting in 2014 as a collaborative effort between ESIP, USGS, Data One, and Data One, as a platform that was recognized or determined to meet a need for a more effective way to be able to discover and access the growing global collection of data management training materials that are widely dispersed across the internet. And as a part of that, also developing a robust model for being able to document characteristics of those learning resources that would be able to provide for effective discovery and understanding of those resources to help users better identify existing learning resources, training materials that they may be able to access and reuse, either for their own individual learning or for those of us that are, doing or developing training for others, being able to look at a very large and diverse collection of training materials that we might be able to either draw on directly or at least seek inspiration from. And so the key component of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse from the very beginning has been that it is a resource for discovering existing learning resources that remain distributed across the internet. We're not storing those resources within the clearinghouse. We are managing the metadata related to those resources and providing a platform for being able to interact with those metadata and enhance those metadata through being able to collect feedback and other information related to the use and discovery of those resources. So we still are very much connected and dependent upon the resources that are out there in the wild, but we've essentially put a discovery and understanding layer on top of those resources through the clearinghouse. So while the clearinghouse went live in 2016, it was recognized from the very beginning, really, that there were additional capabilities that it would be nice to be able to establish in the clearinghouse, and that it would be really necessary to be able to bring in some additional resources to be able to enhance the clearinghouse as it was originally developed, and as needs were identified through use of the initial clearinghouse. So this is where our current project, funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, comes in, where in July of 2018, we started the project with the key objectives of certainly continuing to increase the quantity, the number of learning resources that are in the clearinghouse, but also to diversify the content of the clearinghouse, which, as you might guess from the core of organizations that developed the initial clearinghouse, there was a strong earth science data center of gravity around the collection of materials that were in the clearinghouse. Part of the objective of the enhancement project has been to diversify that content into learning resources related to other disciplines. To look at the lessons learned from the historic use of the clearinghouse and engagement with the community, to look at opportunities to enhance the metadata model itself, identify additional information that would be useful in being able to discover and understand the learning resources in the Clearinghouse, ultimately leading to improved search capabilities within the Clearinghouse. And then also being able to add assessment capabilities. So essentially tools for the community to be able to provide feedback on the learning resources that are in the Clearinghouse, and more through some of our more outreach efforts, provide feedback on the Clearinghouse itself as a platform for being able to interact with the community and provide access and discovery to the learning resources. So this is a few screenshots from the new version of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse that is the one that we will be working with today. So as we talk a little bit about meeting some of those objectives and what we've been working on for the past several years, this is an illustration from earlier this year, looking at the trend line in terms of the increase in the number of published resources that have gone through the full curation process and have actually are discoverable to any users of the Clearinghouse. And then the red line actually represents the additional resources that have been added essentially to our processing queue in the Clearinghouse. And this is why part of our outreach activity is to try to identify folks who might like to work with us in helping to close the gap between the many resources that we had funding for a graduate assistant for the project, who was incredibly productive in identifying new resources that would be candidates for the Clearinghouse, that we need to work through to close the gap, essentially increase the black filled area of this plot to match up with the red line for the number of resources that have actually been registered and are potential candidates for in the Clearinghouse. So we've been able to, been very successful in significantly increasing the number of resources in the Clearinghouse, but we still actually have quite a bit of work to do. And in this plot, you can also see the black vertical line. That represents the beginning of the IMLS-funded project. But we would be remiss in not also acknowledging the contributions of ESIP, as I'll be talking about in a little bit, the ongoing support for the Clearinghouse platform, but also developer support, as we, right after the beginning of the project, discovered that there was going to be a whole nother development activity associated with the Clearinghouse that we had not originally planned on. And ESIP was able to contribute significantly towards being able to do that, as was SGCI, as another organization that contributed development effort to especially first doing some user interface design, and then actually contributing some development effort on the user interface. So I also talked about our goal of diversifying the collection. And this is a couple of different ways that we have been visualizing the diversification in terms of subject categories. So the lower left corner represents we still have the physical sciences and mathematics. That's essentially where the earth science data focus sit within. And you can see that we started out with a very strong representation in earth sciences and mathematics, but we've also now been able to significantly grow the content in these other subject areas. And the upper right plot just shows a more detailed picture of some of the subcategories of these broader subject areas. But this is just one way that we try to communicate the work that's been done in diversifying the content. So it's not just focused on earth science data and information, but it's much more diversified now. We also think about diversity in terms of the target audiences associated with our the content in the Clearinghouse. So this is another critical component in the documentation associated with the learning resources, so that you can drill down and identify learning resources that are really optimized for particular target audiences. And in the upper right, we can see the growth overall in terms of the number of resources that have identified target audiences. But again, the increase in the diversification of those audiences. So, you know, whether it's high school students, early career researchers, data scientists, and the growth across those categories and the introduction of new categories into the collection since we started the project. And in the lower left, just the continued growth of keywords associated with the learning resources in the collection. So I mentioned earlier that that sort of unexpected additional development work that that ended up being a part of the work that we've been doing for the platform. And this was necessitated by the announcement literally 2 months after the project started of the timeline for the end of life for the version of the Drupal web platform that the original Clearinghouse was developed on. And with that announced end of life and the necessary migration ultimately to Drupal version 9, as the model was to have to leapfrog through Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 or wait until you could go straight to Drupal 9. But either way, it was essentially going to be a redevelopment effort of the platform from the ground up. From just about all the Drupal developers that we were talking to, it was not going to be a simple, you know, click 3 buttons and your content will be magically transformed from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. For it to at all be functional, it was going to be a significant lift. And to be honest, after having, you know, worked on projects in which we were dependent upon and subject to Drupal upgrade cycles and security patching requirements, that was not necessarily an attractive prospect. So when given the choice between essentially having to do either a redevelopment in Drupal towards Drupal 9 or adopting another platform, we ultimately actually elected to redevelop the platform using a different technology stack. And this is a stack that includes a more segmented or more separated services-oriented architecture that gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of how we can evolve the platform moving forward. Starting with a data management tier in which our metadata are managed and other components of the system are managed. In this case, it's currently based on the Solar database, but we're already talking about potentially migrating to another database platform somewhere down the road. Having a middle services tier based on Python and Python web services, with the ultimate goal of that services tier providing an open REST-based application programming interface, upon which we then build our client application interface, but that also provides us an opportunity to work with other collaborators as they may want to leverage the application programming interface to integrate the metadata content and capabilities of the DMTC into their applications and their sites. And that's exactly what we've done, for example, in developing those data visualizations. In the previous slides I was showing, those are actually produced through an RStudio, our analytic notebook, in which we're interacting with the application programming interface, pulling the metadata out of the system, and running the analysis and data visualization in R. And that's something that was a principle from the very beginning in terms of being able to design this to give us flexibility for how different client applications can interact with the collection of metadata that we have in the Clearinghouse. This is ultimately also our strategy for long-term sustainability, because technologies change through time. Use cases and demands of the platform change through time. And experience in other projects has led to the insight that these tiers, whether it's the data management tier, the services tier, or the client interface tier, tend to evolve at different rates. And being able to have some degree of an air gap between those tiers allows us to be able to evolve them differently. So when we eventually need to do a database upgrade, we can do so in a way that we would need to modify the way the Python code interacts with that database, But we can hopefully do that, and we've done this in other projects that I've worked on, where it essentially is seamless to any client applications that are currently using that application programming interface. So it gives us a lot of flexibility for being able to evolve and maintain the system in smaller components through time. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch on to Nancy to talk about our homepage, about, and search capabilities in the application.
All right, thank you. For those whom I've not met and can't see, hello, my name is Nancy Hobel-Heinrich. I'm with Knowledge Motifs LLC and been working with Carl for a long time on this and beforehand as well. So it's really nice to finally see the fruition of some long-time dreams. So what I'm going to show you is go into the changes to the Clearinghouse related to the home page, the about page, and then search. And then that for the demonstration part, and then give people a chance to do some searching themselves with in the Clearinghouse. So first of all, what I wanted to show you is the homepage itself. One of the things we learned from the SGCI, the Science Gateway Community Institute user design people, was that they thought that it would be much more interesting to have some changing data to the front page of the Clearinghouse, whereas before it was pretty much focused on you go directly to search, which was great and is great and is fine, but they suggested there might be some other kind of information that we could provide. So we talked with them about showing some, besides the main search function, which is still here, and a little bit about the Clearinghouse with the changing images of the different frameworks that people have towards data management. We added a featured resources column, a recent news item column, and announcements. And while this is, we probably will be refining this a little bit. Oh, thanks, Carl, for. Am I sharing my screen? You can see my screen, right?
No.
Ah, okay. Let me do that again. You'll have to stop though.
Yeah, let me stop sharing. I was showing the home page as you were talking, but it would
okay,
be better
that's
for
great.
you
Thank
to
you.
Point and talk.
Right. Yes. Okay. How's that now? You can see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Can our other online folks? Yeah, I guess they can since you're sharing it.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So yeah. So featured resources, recent news items, and announcements. Now, this is a different kind of. As Carl said, we're still in the beginning stages here. It's pretty text heavy still. We can have, but we have the opportunity for adding images and kind of blurbs about the blogs, and then about these different items. And then if you go up to the blog page, then you see the full announcements there, and full different features and announcements and news items there. So that's something that we will be interested in keeping up with, and would welcome other people in adding information to there as well as we go on. So that's one feature that changed quite a bit. We added also the bullets up on top. There's an about screen, which we had before. Again, it's somewhat text heavy at the moment, but some of the basic information about the DMTC that people will want to know about, including a code of participation, who our audiences are, who our key stakeholders are, and the communities we target. So a little bit more about the Clearinghouse itself that you could go to if you want to, a little bit more about history. So that kind of information will be added as well. And one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later is the fact that we've been working quite closely with the Research Data Alliance, Education and Training on Handling of Research Data interest group. And two of the things that have come out of that group in the last 18 months have been one, a minimal set of metadata, which I'll talk about when we get to search and also to submission, but also a core characteristics document about these kinds of portals and registries and catalogs that will help users and contributors and funders understand more about these kinds of organizations in order to promote long-term sustainability. So that those kinds of things will be included in governance, the fact that we've got an advisory board and other what our operations are, our services are, and so on. So that's the kind of thing that that we will hope will be adding to this about page at least, if not other places. So
and I might add that one of the capabilities that we have at this point is that all of this essentially static content that is included in the blog posts and in the about page, the support page content as well. That's all right now. It's sort of it's a working prototype of a structure of markdown documents and JSON files that we're managing in GitHub. So there's actually a very straightforward way for the broader community to potentially engage through even just producing new markdown-based posts that we can add to the site, or making suggestions how we can update the content through the standard GitHub version control, issue submission, pull request model. So part of our objective here in developing the content model and the way of integrating the content into the Clearinghouse is through this shared and collaborative development platform and the use of fairly low barrier to entry technical approaches like Markdown as a way to develop new static content that's going into the DMTC.
Great, thanks. Yes, that's right. Yeah, so so then the other thing that the other area in which more information will be provided but isn't here yet is the support page, which is where we will be documenting the data dictionary, moving actually the data dictionary that exists about the metadata and about any kind of examples of how different resources and how they're created, how they could be described. This kind of information would be going into the support category that once we, as I said, we've just completed a lot of this, so we need to move it over. But that's the place where people will be able to find information, especially those who are interested in contributing, or interested in knowing more about search, or how to use the different functionality. And speaking of the train, here it goes by. There you go. It's 11:30. Anyway, so. Then the other, and of course, the main function of the Clearinghouse still is the search capability. So this has changed quite a bit from what you might have seen before if you've been to the Clearinghouse. Not only, of course, are the buttons that changed across the top. In general, the search button, the search bar is here. It explains a little bit more about where your search actually goes. So noting that the searches in this area from this kind of keyword approach are searching through the author's metadata, the keywords, the title, and the description. There's an opportunity to clear everything if you want to, which was there last time, but this is, I think, a little bit more easier to see. The number of search results that you get is right here, and you can go backwards and forwards. And it's sorted by the latest entered into the Clearinghouse, which again is different from what we did last time. So you can see that which of the resources are most current or most recently added, put it that way, to the Clearinghouse from this view. So the other thing that's on here is our items per page. You've got different options. You can see more than 10 if you want to 20 or 30 of search results at a time. And then the list of essentially all of the resources starting again with the latest being listed and in a brief record form. So I will show you that in more of that record in a second, but I also want to note that we've got the filters and facets on the left side here, which and note that at this point, what the numbers that you see here are all the totals for all of the resources that are in there. So in other words, we have 260 different keywords that are that are represented in the collection. We have 290 organizations, 1,000 people, 6 different languages, et cetera, et cetera. You can, of course, open these if you want to and see what languages are available. Predominantly English at this point, but we're hoping to add and starting to add more languages as we can, and they're available. And we have people who know how to do that, who know the languages. Target audiences, 21 there. You can see the number of audiences which are most prevalent, mostly focused on early career research scientists, and down to fewer at the bottom. So that is one thing to note about you can search by filters per se, but in addition to putting a search term in and put the filters in, then you can search. Before I go into that a little bit more though, I wanted to show you what the records look like. So this is what you see here on this top one, for instance, is the rating system, the star rating system that Carl will be talking about a little bit later. That's one of the things that we added with the IMLS grant. And the main title, the license is here. This little icon is whether it's a cost or no cost. That's a $sign and not a police car. So don't be confused. The authors are here that are listed, and then starting a brief description of part of what's part of the what's described in that abstract or descriptive part of the record. So to show you the whole thing, then this is the rest of the description. There's key information that's included in different sections, including the URL, which is the place that goes directly to the resource or to the landing page. And then the other information as well. I won't necessarily go into too much detail yet, but note that a lot of these areas that are empty are usually mean that we added some new metadata fields and terms. So if there's no information in the previous records, then of course nothing will show, but that's available to add information if you want to. And then a category for educational information. So you can show more and show less as you'd like to there. And then I wanted to give you just a quick opportunity to show you a little bit more about searching. One thing to note is that we'll talk a little bit later about the different roles that people can have in association with the Clearinghouse, starting from an authenticated user up to an editor. And this is a little different from what we had done before as well. But in terms of search itself, it doesn't make any difference. Everyone in any of those roles can see the same thing through the search functionality. So just to give you some idea of how you might search this, one thing I want to just show you to keep in mind is you'll notice, and this will probably drive metadata people nuts, but that's just the way it goes. We have a lot of keywords that start with data. So guess what? Data is not a good term to use in the search engine. So you would want to use the keyword that's behind it. Okay, so given that, one of the things I wanted to search on, in some ways it's cheating because these are the first ones in, but if you were searching for a term such as governance and you wanted to see what happened, the first thing you can see is that there are currently 8 results that show up on data governance, and they're listed here. Now, to make the distinction, if you wanted to go into keywords and look for data governance, that makes a more precise search of 3. The difference being that the resources that are noted here actually have a keyword assigned, right, to data governance. And so that's a more precise search. If you don't want that, and you still have that same term, then you get more records that have governance in the description or in the title or other options. So that's something to keep in mind as you do the searching yourself in a few minutes. The other thing I wanted to show you about this is that to kind of feature the filters is we've got a lot of information thanks to NASA's amazing collection of resources on remote sensing. So let's see, first I'll clear all of this, and then if you want to search for remote sensing, spell it right, then you can search and you see we've got 33 results that again are have remote sensing somewhere in those 4 categories here, the author's keywords, title, and description. If you wanted to, for instance, find materials that are available in other languages, like Spanish, then you would be able to filter way down to those resources that are available in Spanish with the Spanish metadata created. Now, this is thanks to NASA providing this metadata in Spanish as well as English and other languages as well. But we're hoping to find more and more of those as we go, or people who can translate for us. But that's a really nice capability that's important, and hoping we can really add to that. The other thing that I think is really useful to do here is to clear this again. And if you just have a basic search of the 541 resources that are published now, if you were looking for materials that were focused on certain target audiences. So for instance, if you were looking for information about citizen science, then those resources that are available and targeted to citizen science would show up in the search results. So this is something we've never been able to do before with the old system. And so there are some real advantages to be able to use these filters in the way it's now available to do. Another thing.
Stace has a question.
Oh.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Stace.
I was wondering, by the way, I've been playing around. I love the filtering, really great. So I'm noticing that the filtered items are sorted and it says latest first. And I'm wondering, what is that, what date is being sorted here? Or like, is there any other options for sorting? Or is this like some default kind of date published sorting?
It's not sorted by publication date. It's sorted by the date in which the resource was added and published in the Clearinghouse. So we did have publication date as a sorting we do have still in the current production system, but it turned out to be very almost misinformation for people, that people were not looking so much at the value of the resource itself, but more about when it was published. And that's not always an indication, especially for these kind of foundational courses that these often are, is not as valuable a way to find the resources that they want as we thought. So given the fact, this is sort of a compromise of, as we discover resources and as we're able to add them to the Clearinghouse, they show up first. And then, within when you want to see more, if you look to the publication date, we have that. There is no publication date on this one. Did I pick the wrong one?
You may have.
I think I picked the wrong one, because sometimes there isn't a publication date. But let me go back, because I know there are. Go back here.
And this is one of the byproducts of, we have legacy metadata in the system going back to 2016 that have variable content. And there's also been, there have been interesting issues with what metadata fields Drupal has been maintaining or creating and managing associated with these resources as they're going through sort of the Drupal workflow, which weren't necessarily intentionally used in the current production system in Drupal. And what we're doing in the new version of the platform is being much more intentional about the values that we're putting into these different date fields. There's a date in which the metadata record is initially submitted or created. There are dates associated with any times those metadata records are modified. And then there's a date associated with when the resource is actually published. And we've had a lot of discussions over the past few years about how good these dates are, especially for the older records. Like, for example, the modification dates, as we're harvesting metadata from Drupal into the new system, Drupal does not really have a really good modification date that we can bring in that represents the last time it was modified in Drupal. So all of the imported resources right now have a modification date literally of today, because our last harvest was just this morning, I think. So sorting on modification date at this moment is not going to be terribly informative. One of the things that we are going to be adding is actually making this sort option an option, so that there will be multiple ways to sort the results based on different fields. We have, for example, relevance scores associated with any of these result sets. And being able to sort by that relevance score is also a very key characteristic. So right now, by default, we're sorting by this most recently modified, essentially. But we're going to we'll have some additional sorting options based on other useful fields. Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
I wanted to add one more thing about the modification date. Actually, a lot of the resources, there are two, as Carl said, there are two different dates. There's the date in which the record was modified, but we also add any modification date when the resource itself was modified, if we can make that information available. And again, the way in which people are defining and describing their resources from 2012 to now has changed quite a bit, so that people didn't always have a publication date that they put in, or a broadcast date. It was not evident from either the resource itself or from the metadata pages, the landing pages that we use to get the metadata. So, and then the other issue is that we're still working out when things are displayed and when not, in the interface itself. So there are some fields in here that we've got in the schema that are not necessarily yet appearing. So that's another issue there. So.
And Nancy, I was going to mention that you might want to clear your cache and reload it, because there were the date fields in particular were added to the detailed display earlier today.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't see any publication dates. I thought, wow, didn't we add this? Okay. Well, won't do that now.
Right. Just as an FYI.
Yeah, okay. That's good to know. All right. So was there another question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I mean, this really looks wonderful. Thanks for doing the work. I just had a question though. Have you thought at all about having some kind of mechanism for either the original contributors or for editors or the world at large to sort of periodically indicate whether something is still timely and relevant? I can imagine that over time there might be tools that are no longer used, or NSF policies that have changed. So some, separate from an update date, some kind of way to say, yep, this is still a current good happening thing.
Yeah, one of the things that's one of the functions of the assessment capability that Carl will be talking about later as well. There's a sort of a basic survey default survey that we've created at this point, and which can be changed as well, in which people can comment on their reaction to the resource itself. So if it's something that should be deprecated, for instance, then you can make a comment about that at the resource itself, or that's this kind of thing that you can submit to Clearinghouse Ed. We've got an email feedback address through ESIP where that kind of information can be submitted as well, and we can look at that and then have our review it to see whether it's something that should be deprecated or not. So yeah, that's a good suggestion, because then it's a little difficult to tell. Part of the issue, of course, is time to do that. So that's one of the reasons why we keep asking for people to help and encouraging them to contribute, but making that easier to do is the goal that we have. And again, Carl will talk about that a little bit more with the assessment section.
Right, and this comes back to actually the Science Gateway, Science Gateway
Community Institute.
Community Institute. I can never remember all the words. Because a vision moving forward for the redevelopment of the Clearinghouse and the capabilities that we've been building into the updated Clearinghouse is to much more directly enable community engagement and participation in the entire process, from identifying and contributing materials to providing feedback on materials, making recommendations in terms of resources that should be deprecated or providing updates to existing resources. And so it is much more aiming towards a more collaborative platform that's enabled by the different access capabilities that are enabled through the authentication system that we'll be talking about in a little bit. But that's one, as Nancy was saying, that's one path for being able to address some of those issues. But part of it is also developing strategies to more, to close the loop back to the resource creators, where much of the work so far, and there are some notable exceptions, some of the NASA resources in particular are a really good example of this, where a lot of resources, especially those that were identified over the past several years by our graduate assistant, combing the internet and finding good candidates, we don't have, at this point, good connections with those resource creators. But we do have the capability for being able to enter information about those resource creators in the system now, so that when we have that information, we can start the process of circling back and being able to both provide them access to the feedback that's coming in about the resources they've produced, so they can maybe integrate that into their ongoing development of their resources, but also, again, start to reinforce the connectivity with resource producers and the community of users and reusers and evaluators that we all are participating in.
Yeah, and one way we've thought about doing that is by having kind of domain reviewers or domain editors, and the idea there is that it's people who are either interested in a particular topic, or if they're responsible from an organization's point of view of keeping resources, making resources available and keeping them updated. If they are interested in helping us do that by just focusing on, certain resources or on certain parts of domain or certain organizational products, then that's all they're responsible for. But we can make that as easy as possible in order for that kind of feedback to come back. So that's really what we need to focus on too in the next couple of years, so that it becomes a real valid and current and authoritative community resource. So good suggestion.
Yes.
I just wanted to add, there was a question online, I think that this has been addressed, but Diana did ask about communication with each archive. Do you communicate with each archive, and are you aware if a change has been made to a data set? And I think that's been discussed, so. It's
been addressed, thank you.
Great, just wanted to make sure that got included.
Yeah, I think the short answer is there's still a ways to go, but we're trying to build the mechanisms for being able to do that more effectively.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, good. All right, well, I think that's, I don't think there's much else unless people have specific questions about because we can look at the full records if you want to look a little bit more about what's available in terms of description for different records, or the records from the metadata scheme, or people can just go ahead and do some playing around if you want to. One thing to keep in mind is that this is an engine. What's in the database at this point in this demo database is not is not necessarily the same thing that's actually published yet, that is published in the production system. So you might see some funny things in here that that are not part of what we're are not part of our selection criteria, but I'll show you more about that when we talk about submission. So, but if you have any questions about why some things are in there, that as you're doing the searching, that might be part of what's going on here. So we do have selection criteria that have parameters, but again, I'll talk about that more in the submission part. So any other questions? Should we just go ahead and let people do some searching? And then if you have any questions, you can either unmute and ask, or put them in chat, or put them in the notes as well.
And so we've got about 15 minutes in the agenda right now for you to just explore the Clearinghouse, particularly with the focus on the search and interaction with sort of the collection through the search interface. We'll have some other opportunities later in the workshop for working with some of the other features. But yes, as Nancy said, what we're working with here is essentially a sandboxed copy of all of the metadata from the production system that was just harvested this morning. And so as we go through the search, not as much, because we're not modifying or updating any of the records, but as we go through some of the later exercises in which we can potentially edit or submit or create new records, that's all right, because we're not working on the production system. We're not working against the production records. This is our sandbox to work in for your experimentation and enjoyment. So we'll take about another 15 minutes for you to go ahead and experiment with the search tools. Again, just ask any questions that you might have, add any comments to the shared notes. If you have recommendations about the search that you did that it gave you nothing vaguely resembling what you were thinking about, or that somehow it was the best search ever, we'd love to hear that as well. But please go ahead and experiment.
And I see Diana has another question about how we are planning to provide. Are we planning on providing instructions on how to join your community? And yes, we will. We've got both interest surveys and feedback surveys at the links to those at the end of the slides, and we'll talk about that some later too. So yes, absolutely. Definitely interested in having people join. So I'm going to mute until something comes up. But I'll leave the search screen on unless, I'll share my screen in case somebody has questions about a specific search, and then I can show that.
I'm just checking. I'd like to provide some feedback on the functionality. Should I do that on the ESIP breakout session notes page? There's a section at the very, very end for feedback, but it looks like it's.
Is that Stace? Is that you again?
Yes.
Yeah. See,
basically, where should I put my notes?
So see what I'm showing here on the screen, the notes feedback.
Okay,
I suggest, because there's a place for comments about home, about search, assessment, and then general down here. So
okay, cool.
Whichever, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. To Stace's comment about the variety of international material sources that are in the collection. Our graduate assistant on the project, who was primarily focused on finding new resources, she's an international student, and as a result, I think she was very effective in casting the net potentially much more widely than many of the usual suspects that we might have otherwise been looking at for potential learning resources. Yes. Oh, quiet. Well, maybe it's valuable.
So I was just doing a test search on schema.org, because that was the session. I was in a training session on schema.org this morning, and nothing came up. So now I'm slacking the schema.org guys to say they should put something in. But I'm wondering, what makes a resource or an item? They have these GitHub pages that have various guides and slide decks and stuff off of them. Would it be like selecting you know, a really good entry-level slide deck, or just here's a whole GitHub page, have at it?
Good question. Yeah, that's part of the selection criteria. We can talk about it a little bit later, but now's a good time too. What we've been trying to do with that is to choose resources that are, well, there are a number of factors, and I'll go into the specifics of it, but find resources that are really kind of downloadable and something that you can use and complete. So for instance, webinars that, you know, where you listen to something and you learn something that you can finish at the end. We have curricular guides. We have, but not so much necessarily pathfinders that you would find, for instance, in libraries, because those are available. They're not really resources in the same way that we're describing them. So it's the kind of thing that you would learn from. I mean, we can look more closely at, for instance, where is it here, the media type. So you can see what kinds of things we've got here in terms of the media. So presentations, interactive resources, text. We haven't been doing as much text because sometimes, you know, if it's a book that's available through a different kind of catalog, that's not something we necessarily would add. It's the kind of thing that we, you know, that's unique, something that covers the topics related to both either data management or data skills for data management, research data. And so trying to be as kind of selective, and if it's the resource is special to you, special to someone, is endorsed or sanctioned by others, you know, it's just unusual that it's not really available or found elsewhere, then that's the kind of thing we would add. You know, we've had to balance this against the time it takes and the staff, I mean, volunteer really, staff it takes to create the resource in the first place and maintain it. So we're trying to keep a balance of what we can add that the communities will find useful and that are special and unique. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. They can also be complex resources though too. So sometimes, you know, a tutorial has background information, illustrations, tests, quizzes, that kind of thing that you know help that augment or supplement the lesson itself. And so we have the ways to describe them in such a way that you get, you know, the complex object, but you know, you can also make more specific recommendations or descriptions below that if you want to. So perhaps an e-notebook is an example. You know, if there's a collection of resources related to training that's part of a notebook, but there's something in particular that you really want to bring out as an important table that can stand on its own or is in relationship to that e-notebook, you can add that too. So that's kind of a function of the submitter and the reviewers and editors.
And we've got about 5 minutes left in our first free play session.
Hi, this is Jake Guerin, one of the student fellows here. This is not my expertise by any means, but it's super interesting. So when I see kind of this stuff, I'm wondering, would you ever consider having like, and this might sound silly, but like a Stack Overflow post that's very well regarded as like, you know, the best methodology for certain data management. You know, I don't know, I'm thinking of kind of a generic example, but some of these, you know, open source, you know, resources that are not quite indexed, but they're kind of just, you know, the top on Google and everyone seems to go there. I don't know if you've ever considered something like that. It's just kind of open source, but in a different way. That's
an interesting example. That more and more of those have come available. So we've the selection criteria has to change a little bit based on what people are making available too. I'm thinking we're starting to see more things like somebody just the other day submitted a question about a resource that was the Linux cheat sheet for Linux commands. That's just basically a one-pager, but it's very succinct. It's very well done. So that's the kind of thing that, and it was the creator of this cheat sheet himself in this case. So that's the kind of thing that, yes, does make sense to do. We don't at the moment, in terms of the Slack overflow question, we don't have necessarily a really good way of, we'd have to capsulize something in a way and make sure that, I have to think about that, because if you have the question itself and the thread of answers, then it's a little difficult to, I guess you would have to do is just point to that top level question and describe it to some extent. It might have to be kind of a minimal set, minimal description, but that's a good thought. I can see, especially if somebody who's interested in that topic, submits it and then is helping out, keeping up with the changes in that topic.
I was noticing the intro to SQL, and that's what made me think about it for that reason. And I think, for the record, the Linux cheat sheet is like exactly what I mean. So that's
right.
Yeah, that's awesome that that's happening already. Thanks.
Yeah, good question though.
So we've got just a couple more minutes, and then we'll go back in and start talking about the assessment capabilities that we've developed in the platform.
I think I'll stop share and give it back to you, Carl, for the next.
Sounds good. Yes.
Are you going to go over like how to update existing resources?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yep, that's absolutely, that's our newest shiny.
Okay.
As a part of the development work that we've been doing recently.
Okay, because I have some that I know I need to update, and so there's also the question of, do we do it now or do we do it later? Like, because since you're migrating things currently.
Right. Yeah, any changes we make in the platform here will be blown away during an upcoming harvest, but we can make those changes in the current production system, and those changes will be brought over. So it is just a matter of timing.
Or going into the existing system. That sounded like Madison's. Madison, is that you? Yeah, okay. Yeah, because you can easily do it now, especially if it's about the USGS resources. If you want, you can get in touch with me if you want. Do it while it's on your mind. That's what I say. Or it flips away into something else.
So are there any more questions relating to this opportunity to work with the search interface before we move on to talking about assessment? Hopefully you've had a chance to get a feel for some of the opportunities and potentially some of the sharp edges in the search interface that you can tell us about. You know, that's one of the challenges you run into in developing any applications like this, is that despite your best efforts to try to not find yourself in some sort of well-trodden path through your application, invariably there are an infinite number of alternative paths that real, living, breathing other humans will follow that do not conform to your assumptions and that can highlight weird and odd behavior. And so we absolutely want to hear any and all of that feedback as well. With that, we'll transition now to a discussion of the assessment capabilities that we've been working on as a part of the Clearinghouse. And the link here on the slide to the search page, which you've been working in, is largely the entry point into being able to contribute to and see the results of the assessment capabilities that we have in the system. The assessment model that we've adopted is one that is informed by this tiered approach that Kirkpatrick, and it's now a family, an ongoing family business of Donald Kirkpatrick's children are now continuing the process of building on essentially this 4-tiered approach to doing assessment and evaluation of training in particular. And this model is based on these 4 levels of reaction, learning, behavior, and results, where you can think about assessment of any of your training work as potentially falling in one of these 4 categories, where reaction is probably one of the areas of assessment or feedback that we're most familiar with. As you get that post-workshop survey saying, you know, how did you like it? Were you comfortable? What, you know, what was your immediate reaction to the training experience? And it can be everything from the sandwiches were great, the rooms were too cold, and the content was good. You know, those sorts of things. But then, as you move up in this tiered model, you then start talking about learning. What are some learning objectives? And were you able to make progress towards achieving those learning objectives? This has been a significant area of continued work in the Clearinghouse in terms of trying to, and now at this point, establish a framework for being able to actually document and capture information about learning objectives when they're related to the materials that are in the Clearinghouse. But the learning component in assessment relates to questions of what are the objectives and how were they potentially met as an outcome of this learning experience. The behavior level is much more difficult to really address in what are typically, in many cases, sort of one-off or short-term learning engagements when we're talking about training workshops. But these are impacts or results from a training experience that result in actual changes in behavior. Often when we're doing a post-workshop survey, we'll ask questions about intended changes in behavior as an attempt to try to get to that, still recognizing that it is largely intent as opposed to some sort of actual behavior change that is likely to happen sometime in the future. And then finally, the highest level is this results level, in which you not only change the behaviors that are embedded in your learning objectives, but you actually have achieved results, impacts as a result of those behavioral changes. So your organization's data management workflows have become, you know, more efficient because of the adoption of particular documentation or sharing technologies or tools. Their documentation has become more usable because there's greater knowledge and familiarity with the metadata standards that are used by your community, and the data as a result are more discoverable, understandable, and reusable. Those are the results that we might be looking for. In reality, we find ourselves spending most of our time in the reaction and learning levels, because that's when we have most access to our learners. But the assessment capabilities in the system are designed to be able to actually address all 4 of these levels, and we actually developed a very comprehensive assessment capacity in the Clearinghouse in sort of the middle year of the project, based on a set of questions that came out of the Data One project through their EVA tool, and the link to EVA is provided here. This is a collection of, I believe it's over 90 questions that are categorized in terms of, their level in the Kirkpatrick framework. There are questions there are different ways in which they can be represented in terms of actually implementing them as, different sort of Likert scales, sort of checkbox or free text or those sorts of controls. So it's a really handy and well-curated collection of questions that allow you to potentially create your own survey instrument that could be used and attached to any resource in the Clearinghouse. And that's actually the capability that we built. There's lurking behind the scenes a whole set of components in the application programming interface and in our data management system where you essentially can tap into this set of EVA questions that we already have as a part of the system, but you can also create your own. You can then build surveys from the collections of questions that might meet particular needs. Then you can mix those collections of questions into an actual survey that you can link to an actual resource. So if you were an instructor, this could be a very powerful tool for you to be able to actually have a hosted survey instrument associated with your materials and or the learning experience that you're providing. That having been said, in previous workshops where we have presented this, both here at ESIP and in other venues, the first and foremost interest was in keep it simple. I want a basic form that I can fill out in mere seconds and don't make it too complex. So that very comprehensive capability that we have lurking behind the scenes remains largely hidden, because following that feedback, we have focused instead on being able to provide a basic default survey tool for capturing basic and immediate information for each of our resources, which gives us a degree of comparability for the information that is collected for any resource. And that is what is providing essentially the input for the rating scores that we're going to see in just a second. What? Oh, did I not share? Okay, let me see if I can. Where did Zoom go? I'm always losing it. Did we sign out?
It should be fine.
Oh, okay. There we go. There we go. Thank you. So, yes, this is the underlying model that we're using, and these are actually some of the key indicators and components that relate to that model. But as I said, we have focused on largely the reaction and some of the learning levels in the implementation of the current assessment capabilities that are exposed to the Clearinghouse, but we have an underlying system that allows us much greater flexibility. So let's go to the Clearinghouse itself, and I'll briefly show you that capability in action, and then we'll give you a few minutes to actually experiment with it. So if we go into the search interface, and we basically choose any of the learning resources that we have as a part of a search result set. So I could just use this first data governance result as an example. I can go to the full record display, and you'll see currently there's an NA and no rating score here associated with this particular resource. But I can go to the bottom of the detailed screen here, and this is where we have currently access to the feedback related to the resources. So if there is a survey attached to it, so any of the new, any of the existing resources that have been harvested into the system already by default have our default survey attached to them, so that this should be available for any of our existing resources. If you create any new resources today, those will not have the default survey attached to them yet. That's something that our developer is working on implementing. But we'll start by clicking on this Provide Feedback button. And these are essentially the questions that we have identified as the key initial questions that we are asking to contribute to a general rating for a given resource. So the purpose of the resource is clear. So this is sort of a standard set of Likert questions. Is it effective in helping you reach your data management learning objectives? Absolutely. Is the difficulty of the content appropriate for the level of your knowledge and expertise? Sure, why not? Are the examples applicable? Yeah, somewhat. Are you going to identify any actions moving forward that you will apply? So this is starting to reach into more of a hint of that behavior level in terms of intended changes in behavior. So we'll say, sure, I agree with that. And then there are also a number of free text narrative fields that will also be able to solicit some additional feedback in terms of what I like most, what I like least, how would you improve the resource, what do you need to learn but not get? This is all feedback that can be invaluable for somebody who is both developing this resource in terms of perhaps providing some indications how they might extend the content of the resource, but it also helps us in our process of curation, where we might need to look at how we have developed the metadata for a resource. If we find that a resource isn't meeting the expectations of their users, we might need to look at the metadata a little bit more carefully to see if there are better descriptors or keywords that can be associated with the metadata to produce more properly aligned expectations. So the bottom line is then I have this and I hit submit. And if I go back to the resource, we now have a score. And this is the score of now one input, unless some of you were also in the process of adding your own feedback while I was demonstrating it, because this is a composite of the average of those first 5 numeric fields. So each input produces, so we have 5 individual scores for those different categories, which we can potentially slice and dice through pulling through the API, the individual survey results. But we're also writing into the metadata the overall, the individual average score of those five ratings, and then also calculating an overall score of all of those averages, so the average of averages. And that's what this represents here. And if I were to, submit another feedback, and I'll just randomly be a curmudgeon, and I'll say, I mostly disagree or strongly disagree. And when I submit that, and I can go back to the resource, we can now see that my 4 has now instantaneously gone down to a 2.8, representing the change in that overall average for the submitted feedback. And finally, now that we have some feedback, we can click on this link to actually view the individual the individual responses from now the 2 responses that we have for each of those questions, so that you can see the narrative descriptions here. And we haven't started integrating the free text fields in yet, but that will be also a part of this presentation. And if we then go back to our search results, we can see that that is now also represented in the summary display in the search interface. So we have about, let's see, about 15 minutes for you to poke around in the assessment tools and, again, provide us sort of your take on the capabilities that have been provided, any suggestions about other assessment questions you might want to ask and answer through the information that we're collecting, and if you have good examples of other assessment models or frameworks that we might be able to use, we'd love to hear about those as well.
Diana has a question, Carl.
Oh, yes.
Or statement, comment.
Hi. So I actually, I'm just curious, do you record who is doing the assessment? So who is doing the assessment, and is that information available to both the author as well as anyone who's visiting?
Well, you know, that's an excellent question, because this is something that we've gone back and forth on. You'll notice that I hadn't yet logged in to the system. I am still essentially an unauthenticated, largely anonymous user. There are always ways to try to get information, but we're actually not tracking that type of information associated with these submissions. So at the moment, these are essentially anonymous submissions, but in anticipation of comment spam, we're seriously looking at a need to actually require that feedback only be provided by authenticated users, so we have a way to then easily sort of clip out the spam as it starts to emerge on the system. Nancy can vouch for that inevitability, as it has taken a fair amount of her time on the production system for the submission of resources through the public interface, which does not require user authentication for the basic submission of an initial resource. But right now the feedback is anonymous, but when we link it to our authentication system, that would be available.
So one thing to consider is it might, you might consider not having to have, I mean, if you, another way you can go is, instead of having to clip out the useless or bad stuff, is go ahead and leave it in, but make it transparent who's doing that. Mm-hmm. So that the community can judge, this is a spammer.
Right.
As long as this person, so that you build your own reputation that way.
Right. And this is one of the areas where, especially with the publicly accessible API that we have, it would be trivial for someone to look at the interaction between the website and the backend API to automate any sort of nefarious or legitimate interactions with the system. Exactly. to game the ratings as they are collected.
That is something that I think should be considered very carefully.
Yes.
Especially with scientists. So, okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I had 2 questions. First is it possible to show how many people have provided feedback for that score?
That is embedded. If we go back
without clicking into it, like it would just say like 2.8 stars by 50 users or 1 user.
Actually, that would be trivial to implement, because literally these NA values here are determined by the number of scores that that are contributing to that overall score. So we're even in the interface itself processing and calculating the number of responses so that we can say, no, there have been no responses, or all the responses have been 0. So we're able to distinguish between those. So that's an excellent suggestion as an additional piece of information that we could provide later today, practically.
The second is it easy to make the ability to sort by number of stars? Like if I'm looking for a particular training source and the top 3 are rated 1 star, could I say, show me highest rated training sources at the top and see?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is where, as a part of the ongoing development of the metadata model, we have now integrated the assessment scores, the summary scores, and the array of individual scores that contribute to that average of averages. Both of those are now essentially first-class citizens in our metadata, which then allows us to do that sort of sorting. And as we're implementing essentially the sort control, that will absolutely be a part of it. But your question raises for me also the potential, I think this would be a good one, of adding that as a filter on the left as well. So we can actually just have an easily exposed, give me only 4 and 5 star. Like when I come to a city like this, I'm always looking for those, 3 or 4 star, $2 or $1 sign places to eat. And so you can look for that intersection of reasonably highly rated that meet some other criteria sort of resources.
I had a question about the assessment form. Is it recording, at least in the background, the search criteria that led them to that resource?
No, but it of course is it's recording the information about it's linking the results to the resource itself, but not the search criteria that led to it.
Okay, because one of the things I'm noticing was I'm running through the search function. I keep running into issues with relevancy, and a lot of your questions in your assessment, if that resource was not relevant to my source, to my search, then I'm going to rate it poorly.
Right.
Versus if it was relevant. And so that's something you might want to consider, because it's going to guide the way, and then your ratings are going to be a little screwed up.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's a great suggestion. And whether it's the entire sort of search blob, or in the background for each of the metadata records that are returned as a part of the search, there actually is a relevance score embedded in the metadata for that particular result in the search. So that would be another piece of information that if we didn't store the entire sort of search string, certainly storing that relevance score as a part of the information related to that survey response could be really interesting.
So to kind of add on to that, though, I guess my question is, when do we anticipate users completing that assessment? Because I would foresee, I do some searches to find something, and I'm not going to fill out that form immediately, because I'm going to check out that resource. And then by the time I come back, I might have a different search on how I get there, right, or something. So I think that's worth considering too, though.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why we actually developed the particular, so the link to go to this particular, it's probably nearly invisible, but if I hover over the link, or if I go to the page, this is actually a stable URL within the API for this particular survey, for this particular resource. So if I was an instructor and I wanted to use this or another survey form that's developed and hosted by the system this is a URL that I could share with the participants in my workshop to capture that feedback. And it would be specific to this resource and this particular set of questions. So we tried to design it so that these are shareable and persistent connections to a particular survey instance for a given resource. But because you're absolutely right, just sort of a random user coming across a resource is not our likely and certainly a less productive contribution to feedback. Is like, this looks great, 2 thumbs up. But being able to share those at a time in the future after potentially a training experience is potentially much more valuable.
I just found a resource where when I followed the link, it said the resource was unavailable. Is there a quick way to report that? Should I put it in as just the thing I like least about the resource? That certainly would be a good place to add. That's probably the most immediately maybe satisfying, I don't, or immediately accessible pathway for providing that feedback. The other way, of course, at this point is through the DMTC email address. So you could just let us know, and we can manually handle that. And if you were an authenticated user in the system that had a, I'm trying to remember, I think it's a submitter or higher level of group membership, you could make a suggestion that a resource be deprecated or go from published back to a review status as a way to also signal that.
Submitter. It's submitter and above can do that, can ask to have something deprecated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just a couple of tiny little usability comments. For that survey, the little icons don't look to me like clickable links. So I was kind of confused about how to actually get to view the feedback because the text wasn't clear. Maybe it's just me, but I thought that'd be worth it. And also for the filter for the access cost, it says true or false, which you can kind of figure out, but yeah.
Well, it's funny, as we've been going through more of the tuning and tweaking, there are some of our fields that have values that go into the database that do not translate as well to human readable and usable values. And we're working with our developer to update our schema so that we are able to create pairs of user-friendly values in comparison to the machine-friendly values that are stored in the database.
Yeah, it's great. I don't mean to nitpick.
No,
it's a good system, but sometimes it's helpful to have someone like
that is an excellent reminder of and very helpful for helping us prioritize, because I know that's been one of the things in the front of my brain for the past couple of weeks, that particular one.
Thank you. Have you considered like link checking to see if they're valid and either kind of?
We do have that. We do have that in the production system. Yeah, and we're definitely, that's part of, it's part of the system.
So what happens then if you come across an invalid link in the current system?
I don't know about the develop. Carl will have to answer that one.
Yeah.
The other one, you check it.
Yeah, and we do have the hooks in the system, in the development system that we're working with today for doing that link checking. And right now it's lurking in the background as we've been cycling through the resources and focusing primarily much more so on the user interface. But again, this is where the availability of our API is coming into play, because it allows us to actually set up external processes that can regularly pull record information, do that link checking, and with the proper credentials actually update. And we have additional fields in the metadata for doing that sort of quality control, so that we can look at the history of checks. Because the unfortunate thing is that a single link check and a failed link check may be ephemeral, but if we can establish a pattern through a history of failed link checks, then that's something that we can even automate the process of maybe unpublishing a resource or flagging it for further examination. And that's, we have the metadata elements in the background for being able to do that. We just haven't written essentially the process to run sort of on the side of the system for doing those checks and writing the results into the system.
Okay, great, thank you.
The other thing that's interesting about that whole question is what people make available for the URL itself. One of the things that we discovered as a result of using the URL checker in Drupal is that, for instance, Zenodo creates the URL that Zenodo establishes or associates with a resource is actually something that changes all the time based on access to it when somebody clicks on it. So that is not a persistent URL that we're trying not to use that when possible. So that if there's it's an argument for putting a citation in and getting a DOI for a resource that is a much more persistent ID, but part of that issue that you're describing in terms of the kind of the persistence of the URL itself has to do with what people consider to be the location URL. So that's an evolving practice as well that we're watching and trying to help.
And I was going to mention, because we had scheduled a break for the next 10 minutes or so. So I wanted to, certainly we can continue to have our discussion, but I also wanted to let folks know that, if you want to stretch, get a beverage, take a bio break, whatever it is you might want or need to do. This is our window to do it for the next 10 minutes. But yeah, we're happy to stay and continue the conversation. It's just, we'll be doing it more loudly as we're a mixed in-person and virtual audience.
So a break if you want to for 10 minutes and then back at 55, right? Okay. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'll be right back.
Sounds good, Nancy.
Okay. All right, everyone back?
Mostly.
Okay. All right. Those who are coming back, I hope people come back. All right. So what I'm going to talk about and show you and then get an opportunity to work with is the submission curation and editorial workflow. So what can I get it to move? Yes. So just a little bit of background that I think is important to keep in mind about this whole process that's associated with the Clearinghouse. And that is one of the things that's really, I think, helps the Clearinghouse stand out in relation to other kinds of catalogs and registries is the fact that there's very careful curation that's been involved in this. Most of the catalogs that are bigger really and are doing machine scraping of metadata. So they're not necessarily choosing resources based on the same kind of criteria that we are. And so I think that that kind of human touch associated with it, the curation aspect of it, is a really important thing to keep in mind in terms of the content that's available through the Clearinghouse. And that's a function of, as Carl's been talking about, the graduate students who are looking for resources, but also the initial set that the three different organizations contributed were really an indication of good quality resources and real attempts to help people who are working at who are knowledge levels at different levels and have different parts of the whole research data lifecycle, research lifecycle and data lifecycle. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and we'd like to continue doing that as much as possible with, other, with people who have expertise in a number of different areas. That is also then shows that the resources in the Clearinghouse itself is community driven and supported. And then the quality of the metadata is also excellent too, when in the sense that most of the time the resources that are being described are good quality, and we try to find descriptive descriptions that really flesh out the resource itself, so people know what they're getting, and also they can for either their own purposes of study and learning, or for teaching and learning, using those resources to teach others. And that with that new assessment capability as well, there are really opportunities to provide feedback to resource creators and resource adapters. So I think that's important to keep in mind. In terms of the process, the review and publication process itself, I've talked a little bit about the selection criteria, and I'm going to go to that in a second. We've had tutorials that allow people to figure out how to create the descriptions. In the older system, that's not yet updated, because as you can tell, we're still in the process of working with the submission workflow in the new system. But the other thing that's important to know is that the descriptions that we're using, the metadata scheme that we're using, is one that is very well, it's a reputable schema. It's got a resources behind it. It's maintained by Dublin Core, which, if you're know about metadata, is an organization that's been around for a long time and really has good quality in both the schemas themselves and the way they're maintained. And then the schema is also endorsed by schema.org, which is important for the purposes of broadening the discovery of the resources, and also for the opportunities it provides to share the metadata with other organizations and other catalogs and registries as well. So the other thing that I think I mentioned early on is that we are conforming to the recommended minimal set for the Research Data Alliance group, Education Interest Group, just published about a week or so, about a month or so ago. And we're very involved in helping to create that and definitely using it. And then we have, as Carl mentioned as well, and I have, if you've got any questions or interest, there's the Clearinghouse Ed at ESIP Fed that allows you to make those kinds of comments. Just in terms of the kinds of resources we're looking for, this is the whole list that we've got right now. And again, this is a list that's come from the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative. It's actually in a process of changing as well, but all of these types will continue to be ones we use, and there may be others as well that are either broader or narrower. So that we'll talk about that a little bit more when I show you the search criteria. And then I want to go now to that selection criteria for just a second, wrong one, to show you a little bit more about that. So this is available right now on GitHub as a markdown document. We'll move it into the Clearinghouse, on that about page, or sorry, support page, as I mentioned earlier. But this kind of gives you an idea of the scope of the topics that we're looking at. We are really interested in educational resources that are downloadable or interactive digital assets that can be used for teaching, learning, and assessing. So the idea of Pathfinders, for instance, I mentioned that earlier. While those are good resources that can be downloaded, if they're available in that sort of format, they're not necessarily interactive. So the idea is to just try to find resources that we would include into the Clearinghouse that can meet that are either downloadable, or you can go back to it, but it's interactive in some way. So again, web pages don't necessarily that have some information that you might find, for instance, as part of a library provides research data services. resources that are associated with a class and that kind of thing, that kind of thing changes a lot and sometimes is very basic and compared to what it is very similar to what others might do. So we wouldn't necessarily include that kind of thing as a resource within the Clearinghouse because it's a little bit more generic. It's not as interactive and it is not unique. So that's the basic definition. And then the scope, as Carl mentioned, it's been changing. We started focused on earth science, but and we're looking at two key stakeholders, both students of data skills and teachers of data skills. So, there are, of course, people can be in one or both of those categories at the same time, depending on, what your job is, what your responsibility is in the area of data curation or data management, data research creation, data creation. So there are times when, you are either a teacher or a learner, but we're always trying to think of the kinds of things that are important to learn or know when it comes to that research life cycle or data life cycle, which is one of the reasons we have those, icons or those images that show up on the front page itself. There are different views of that, but so for instance, USGS has a view of research life cycle. Data One has one, and et cetera, et cetera. But of those different views, what are the different skills that are needed, and what are some of the different tasks that are associated with that? And we try to find resources that help people, either teach or learn that. So that's basically what the language is in that paragraph about scope of topics. But the other specific criteria are really learning resource type, and we'll talk about that in a second. The format, which again has to do with the downloadable aspect of it, the target audiences, and then the subject disciplines covered, the uniqueness of topic coverage or method of instruction. So in terms of subject discipline, for instance, we don't have kind of steered away from bio and medical kinds of resources because there are some excellent catalogs that really cover those areas much better than we really could, we just decided are out of scope. So bioschemas is a metadata schema that shows up in TESS, for instance, which is a catalog, out of the Netherlands, and others like that. So we try to find our niche, given our primary audiences really have been earth science, but the sciences in general. And then in terms of the learning resource type itself, the ones that we find that we've used the most often are courses, units. So lesson, unit, and course are all kind of related to each other and they could be nested within, or they could exist separately. Demonstrations or simulations, learning activities themselves, and this is the sort of thing that might be an example, or what NASA used to call a data recipe, where you have certain kinds of data that you want to learn about, and how do you use it. Some of the remote sensing resources, again, from NASA are perfect examples of that as well. Then educator curriculum guides that cover topics and are something that you could download and use if you're teaching. And then images and visuals, tables that would be associated with a resource or that kind of thing. There are others that are part of that schema that I mentioned from LRMI, but we don't use them quite as much. So textbooks, primary sources, assessments. We have many fewer of those in the inventory, just because they haven't fit the criteria, the other criteria above, but also they're not necessarily unique and are not available. So that's what I wanted to show there. I don't know if you have any questions. Anybody has any questions anywhere through this, go ahead and stop me. We'll also see this as we start working through the submission workflow itself. So then getting back to the slides, the other thing I wanted to show you that is hopefully this you can see this. Let me actually make it bigger so you can see it. This shows the workflow for the different kind of personas or people who are involved in the publication process, and what the different kind of status codes are for working through the process. So you'll notice that the first persona is an authenticated user, and this is again a lesson learned the hard way, as Carl mentioned earlier. A couple of years back with the existing production system, a number of people suggested that we just allow unauthenticated users to drop in a resource in a very basic required fields that included title, URL, and then the name. And that works sometimes, but we've also gotten a lot of spam that I think is coming from automated processes that are just finding open sources like this and dropping things in. So that's taken a lot of time, and it's not really worth it, because most of the resources that are dropped in that way do not relate to our criteria. So we've decided to only allow authenticated users to submit a basic short form, and I'll show you what that is. Then there's a submitter who's got a little bit more functionality, is able to do more, who will then move things into a reviewer. Reviewer can look things over. There are specific tasks here that you can see if you wanted to look at this in great detail. From the reviewer, it could go back to the submitter, or it could go forward to the editor, who has other functionality, including both deprecate or delete, actually deprecate, rather we don't delete anything from the database, and then publish itself. So the status that you'll see as we're looking at the submission workflow form are in red here. So in process, in review, pre-publication review, or deprecate request, and then publish or deprecate. So keeping that in mind, and again, if you've got the slides open, you can come back to this if you want to. The other thing I wanted to mention, and we'll see this as we go through the form itself, is the publication process has different tasks that are summarized here among the different users. So an authenticated user can identify a resource, fill out the required information, and then save or submit it. Submitter gets the same functionality, but this is the whole form, not just the required information. The reviewer can do all of that except publish. The editor can do all of that and publish, and then of course, and deprecate, which I forgot to add. So that's the process by role. And then in terms of control vocabularies, that's also changes by role. So that, and again, you'll see this in the form, authenticated user, the first three can add control names, to personal names, to organizational names, and to keywords. The keywords themselves, they can all be suggested. They may not necessarily be added, because the editor is the one that looks at those to see, is it something we already have? Should the form be changed, etc. And then the editor also can add to target audiences, media type, and learning resource type, as well as subject disciplines. So that's something that is a communication and collaboration among the submitter and the users, the submitters, and the reviewers.
And it looks like Diana may have a question.
Oh, okay.
Hi. So, so you're saying, so an authenticated user is, I can see a use for, I don't know whether, okay, so this is going to be a permissions question. Can anyone add their name to any record, or can you only add your name to the record that you submitted? And then same thing for keywords, because I can imagine, for instance, that like you wouldn't want a random person, a random authenticated user, to be able to add their name to someone else's record. On the other hand, they might find another use for a data set that wasn't originally intended, and so they might want to add a keyword later. So those are sort of permissions scope questions.
Right. Yeah. So let's see. Let me go back here. So oh, there, sorry, this keyword. So the thing with the keyword is what we've got now is anyone can suggest a keyword to add, but it's not really added until it goes through the whole kind of QA and curation process. In terms of names, I think you mean maybe author name or contributor name, that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah. So again, those names can be added or suggested by anyone, but they're not really added until the editor has a chance to look at them and see.
So anyone can add anything, but it has to go through review.
Right, before it's actually published or gone through the process. Now, one of the things we've added with the new metadata set is the idea of persistent identifiers for people.
Yeah.
So if you have an ORCID ID, for instance, then we ask you to include that kind of information, because that not only it's sort of a barrier, but it's also a safety. It's also kind of establishes authority and provides a little bit more commitment. So that should help, and also organization names, so that people can, we can check these out if people add something that is spam, or maybe isn't the real name, sort of the authority name, to the extent it's possible to do that without checking it. So it would, if it's an editing situation, that again can be saved. That's part of a save or submit, but to republish it as a modification, the editors make that final decision. So
and I might add that when we see the submission interface in just a moment, there are a number of places where names can be provided depending on their role in the process. The individual submitting the initial metadata, that's automatically stored by the system based on their authenticated username. But then the other information in terms of authors, organizational authors,
contributors,
collaborators, contributors, those are all separate elements in the metadata, any or all of which can have the names, either organizational or individual names, entered into them depending on what's appropriate.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. So then I think that's it for that, unless there are any other questions. What I wanted to do then, oops, wrong way, is to go back to the interface itself. And now I wanted to kind of show you what you would see as you go through those roles, just to get an idea of what's possible to do. So this is the home screen, nobody's logged in. I'm not logged in at this point. I go to the contribute field, there's a contribute tab, and I need to log in, right, in order to do anything. One thing I want to show you so that you can use this as you want to as I'm speaking is that list of test accounts that's up on top. What I encourage you to do first, if you want to try this, is to just come in as a authenticated user. I'm going to use 10. I don't think we have 10 people here, but you can, actually it's this one, but use that and see for yourself what you'd see when you come in as an authenticated user.
Could you make it just slightly larger for folks in the back of the room, please, Nancy?
The screen?
Yeah, or the usernames and passwords too.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So okay. So I'll make this bigger.
Basically demo underbar 01 through 0 or
10.
through 10. And then all of the passwords are uppercase work, $.
Yeah, let me put that in chat
1, 2,
here.
3.
I put the demo, the password for demos in the chat. So that's there. Okay, so here, we're gonna log in. I'm gonna do 10, as I said, although more than one person can do this. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so here I am logged in as 10. This tells me which group I'm a part of. And so if I go to contribute at this point, then you can see this is the basic form. So as an authenticated user, you can enter the title, the URL. You can change this access cost to yes or no. And then, as Carl said, your name and email address are captured by the system. So that's all you can do here. If you want to do something more, then you would, this should not be submitter, actually. I think this.
Yeah, your submitter, so you
yeah, which should not be part of the demo, but we won't worry about that now.
Yeah.
So, Carl, I mean, I used to get that quite right. So this is where you would, up at the top, let me go back, you would go to contribute. You would go to contribute, there you go. And here's the basic form. If you want to do more, add more, then you would switch to this. You'd lose anything you put in there. So you want to make sure you do this. The core information is still here. I'm going to go down a little bit more so you can see this a little more easily here. And then we can pump it back up in a second. Is that the right one? Yeah. Yeah, so here's the full list that we saw earlier. The order in which these are offered, it is also subject to change, and appreciate feedback on that. This is where you would add the metadata about the resource itself. So here's where the author's names can come in. So you put in a given first, given, or a family name, any identifiers if you have them. The type is the type of ID that you're contributing, and that's something that can change as well by suggestion. Then they are put together. If you want to add those names, then they show up down here as a combined information, and if you check it, it's checked, and you would add that as the author. So if you don't want them to be added, then you uncheck it. Okay, same is true essentially for organization. That's for authoring. And then contributors is a similar structure. Contributors' family name. The type is this list that we've come up with based on the kinds of things that we have seen. And that somebody asked the question in the notes about whether these control vocabularies are kind of standards or not. And it really depends. In this case, not really. We have looked at other contributing ontologies, taxonomies, such as the credit roles and so on. And so far, none of them really relate to learning resources very well. So this is, I think, definitely a work in progress, but those kinds of things can be added as well. That's where you enter the new one. If through the control below, that's where you would make your suggestion about a contributor, about any of the control vocabularies that are possible. That's where contributing organizations, it's the same control vocabulary for the type. Then the information, the educational information, and is below that with the resource contact name here, and then information about licenses and access conditions, accessibility features, and the location identifier. Someone also asked a question about, how do you know what these definitions are? And one of the things that's on the list of things to do soon is to add a little, info button that provides definitions at least, if not scope notes, or the scope notes will show up in that support document, the support page that we talked about as well. So that's suggestions about how to do that would also be appreciated.
Right. And Nancy has already developed that information. It's just the recalcitrant developer, me, hasn't added those little info buttons yet. Right.
It's time. It's scarce. So that's basically, let's see, what else do I want to show you with this? So that's submitter. The thing, okay, so that's the basic form. Now, if we wanted to edit, I'm going to load some demo resource values here that Carl helpfully put in. If this is one that you want to edit, of course, there's no way to edit it right now, is there? Edit button, it's not there. Let's go back to search and say we want to pick one that we want to augment. This is a perfect example of why we have the selection criteria. So, and disadvantages of the current anonymous user. So these are the kinds of things that were added between yesterday and this morning for resources through that anonymous user, local online competition for contractor leads, veteran-owned small company. None of this has anything to do with research data, life cycle. The other thing that's been really big is gambling. Gambling has been very big over the years, and it changes. But anyway, so what you would do is choose one. Let's say we choose this one, which is one that just came in recently. We want to edit the resource. We go here, the whole form is there. And this is where you would then edit. This one is just a short form. All I did was add the short form at this point, but that's an example of what you would do. So hopefully the URL, and this shows up. So when, to do that, here's the URL that gets you to the thing itself. And from there you would, hopefully that's a landing page, which is in this case, you would fill out the information that's here. So that's the basic idea there. The other thing, now here's again, if you want to come back to something, here's that UUID for the resource that is the basis of that URL for the sort of the persistent identifier for the record itself that you can come back to. The other thing I wanted to show was the in process, where the records are in the workflow process. So you'll notice, for instance, with all of these at this point are set in process. The options are for a submitter the in process is what happens when the short form is saved and submitted. Then it's moved into that process we saw before. It goes to the submitter. The submitter would then move it forward into the review, submit for review, or the submitter could say, this is not appropriate, let's deprecate this. So that's where you would choose that. And then make your decisions from there. Now, if we were to log in, and this is also on the notes field here, if you were to log in as reviewer or editor, I'll just do reviewer. It's basically the same. Well, that's not true. It's this. Let's do reviewer first. I think we have time still, right?
Yeah, we're doing okay.
Okay. So let's go back and log out. Log out again, you have to hit it twice. Reviewer, same password in this case. All right, we want to go back to contribute, same form, go back to search. And again, you want to find one that, I don't know why that one's available. I'm going to go find my, nope, it's gone now. Somebody must have added. Okay, this looks reasonable. So if you want to edit, this is in process, right? What's available here is another stage of the process. Then once the reviewer looks at it, makes corrections, changes, whatever, then that it's submitted for pre-publication review or deprecation review. And then it goes to the editor who will have, I guess I can show that too if you want to, but it's basically publish or deprecate or the additional ones. So if you edit the resource here, it's the same thing, except there's more information about the system itself that gives you an idea of what's happened with the resource, with the record, and where it is in the process. So here's again that resource ID. The status is, yes, it's published, or yes, it's in process, or no, it's not. It's in review. It was published the first time in 2018. This is obviously something that I'm not sure this is true. Oh, this front, yeah, could be. So if there's any modification, that date should show up there. The submitter name, the creator of the record, and then the rating if there is any, if anybody's done any user assessment on it. So this is the place where you can add other other keywords if you want to, or suggest keywords as reviewer, make any other kinds of corrections that come up. And, then you would go back and submit it, which is the same as save. And then it would move into the next stage of the process, which is to the editor. So just to show you that very briefly, it's essentially, you can guess what it looks like. Editor, same password in this case. Contribute, search. Let's do this one. So again, here is the difference is being you're able to publish or you're able to deprecate the resource. So, and again, you would do the changing, and when it's ready to publish, you'd hit the submit and save, and it would be published. Okay. I think that's all I wanted to show there. So if you're willing to want to try something, I've got a list of records that you could, on the notes again, where they go. You can look at some of these if you want to. They're going to be in the system. They're probably not published yet, so you can add to it and change. You can create some of your own. What do we got? 15 minutes for this one?
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes closing up.
Yeah. So any questions at this point, or? Again, if you have any feedback or notices, anything you want to mention, there's a place here to do that.
So, and I might add that, you know, one of the sort of embedded principles in the current setup for the entry and workflow is that they're currently separated, in that you're not in the process of entering and submitting updated metadata. You're not changing the status of the resource metadata itself. You're not changing it from, you know, pre-publication review to published. That's actually a separate step that that we wanted to sort of intentionally at this point keep separate, in terms of you can update and continue to update a resource metadata, and then when you're ready, that workflow step of publishing or even unpublishing or deprecating a resource is just a separate option through that little pop-up menu at the top of a view of the metadata record.
I have a quick question. The submission and review process seems, you know, intensive. And obviously, nobody's going to be submitting, you know, hundreds of things at once. But I'm curious if it'd be possible to submit like an RIS file to automatically populate some of the fields, and that would probably cut down on work for both the submitter and the reviewer.
Ooh.
I like that.
Yeah, Carl. Get that guy's name. Yeah. Or the other thing we talked about doing is duplicate, allowing duplication of records, because sometimes, you know, if you're doing something in a series, a lot of it stays the same, and you want to just change a couple things, URLs, or, you know, who's the author first, that sort of thing. But so that's another way to move the workflow along.
So is this also available through the API, like the different ways to contribute?
Absolutely, and this is one of the areas where lurking behind the scenes, we have basically there's a JSON metadata structure that is both what is used for the rendering of the metadata in the user interface, but it also is the submission package that is submitted as a part of, in this case, the submission from the user interface. But if you were if you wanted to develop another workflow that could automate the process of you capturing the metadata for your resources in another tool or environment, all you need to do is generate those standard JSON metadata packages, and through the API call, submit those but while also going through the necessary authentication step, because on the server side, it implements the business rules for saying, you know, are you authorized to actually submit or modify metadata in the system? So, I could write the worst user interface in the world that enforce nothing related to authentication or users, but the API and the backend server has those rules baked into it as well. So we've tried to then mirror those business rules on the front end. But yes, you could, through whatever process you wanted with the proper authentication credentials, work through the same process.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, and if Nancy goes back, the initial, it depends on your authentication state. If you are the most basic authenticated user, all you see is that basic three field form, and you don't have an option to go to the advanced form. If you are in the submitter role, you're also initially provided that basic three field form, but you can change over to that more advanced form to fill in additional metadata. And then as a reviewer or editor, or administrative user for that matter, you default to the full form. But there is actually an option when you're creating a new resource to actually go back to the basic form. So Nancy, if you click on that, you'll see that that button changes from advanced form to basic form. So you could stay in the basic form and just quickly bang out a bunch of it's almost like resource placeholders, to quickly enter a bunch of resources that will have more metadata created, filled in later. Yep.
Yeah, that's basically what I did with the Linux one. The Linux cheat sheet was to just do it short form, and so I don't lose it and put it into the queue. Yeah.
So I'm curious why you have the two, like authenticated user and submitter. Like, why not just have like anybody who's authenticated being a submitter? Like, because I think the only difference is you get the full form, right?
The basic user does not have the privilege to be able to actually forward a metadata record for further review.
Okay.
So it's basically the point of entry for being able to just allow the broadest and most unvetted population of users on the site to be able to make very basic contributions, and then being able to then have the submitters with that have we've at least talked to, given the additional option of filling out the longer form, and also participating in some of those, and that the first stage of those routing workflows for either pre-deprecation review or no, it's just submit for review. It's the reviewer that then can do the pre-deprecation submission or the pre-publication submission.
Okay, and then are there notifications along that pipeline, or like what, other than like changing the metadata status from like in process to ready for publication, like, yeah, maybe there's too many right now for that to matter, or that would be overwhelming.
Well, we have what we've been doing with in the production system, and hopefully we can modify what this process is. On GitHub, we've got one of the repositories is resources workflow, and so there are different kind of columns for each of those stages along, and the resource itself moves through the process. There's registered, in review, needs further work, needs revisions, publication, remove, etc. So that it's possible to, that's what we've been using to kind of find out where things are from a visual point of view too, and a little bit kind of broader view. So hopefully we can adapt that to, there's just a couple of other stages that are part of the new process that we'd have to add into it. But that's available for anyone who wants to be part of it as well.
And that flow chart that Nancy was showing earlier has been informed by our experience in that, GitHub issues based and GitHub projects workflow based model that we've been using for the past now 3+ years for the new resources that have been entering our queue. And now we're essentially trying to implement a version of that we can manage completely within the system.
Okay, great.
One thing I wanted to add too, just so that, and then Diana, I see Diana has her hand up. In terms of the difference between authenticated user and submitter, it is true that you would, if you move to submitter, you're part of the conversation. You're part of the curation process, whereas you're not as an authenticated user. So there's more responsibility. There's also more communication. You really can be more involved there as well. So for instance, if a reviewer wants to ask the submitter to add some more information about it, then you can send it back to the submitter, but you couldn't do that to the authenticated user. So there's just sometimes people just want that basic level of dropping things in so that it gets part of the queue, and then we can take it forward depending on your level of commitment you want to offer to it. So Diana, did you?
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions and then a suggestion. I think I know the answer to this, and I think I probably missed it in your walkthrough, but the author is not me. It's the person who created the resource.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. And the contributors are who?
Contributed to the resource. So for instance, if you let's look at some of the values here. Where is contributor?
What's the difference between an author and a contributor?
A contributor is not the creator of the resource. These are the kinds of things that you probably can't see this very well, sorry. But the contributor, the author, so the contributor could be a co-presenter with the author or not. They could consider themselves collaborator. And remember, this could be an organization or a person. It could be that they're involved in conceptualizing the resource itself. This is the kind of thing that you see, for instance, there are some resources in the digital humanities. They have a couple of organizations, a couple of kind of associations of digital humanities folks have available on their landing pages for their resources who came up with the idea of how to do something. And this happens with content created through, I think, carpentries and so on as well. People you contribute in different ways. Maybe you come up with the idea, but you're not involved in actually creating the thing itself. So it's a way to provide some attribution, some credit associated with the resource itself that you can choose to add to the record. It's a way of establishing both the association as a person or as an organization and the expertise as well. So or the funder, for instance, sometimes people put the granting organization in, and so they would be contributing as funding and sponsorship, that kind of thing.
Are these terms, is it different? So I'm thinking from the academic publication point of view. Just that's where I'm coming from. So is the differentiation between author and contributor made clear, defined somewhere?
That's part of the, hopefully that's part of the scope notes and the definitions that are not appearing at the moment, but will. So yeah, they'll.
So for instance, if I were searching for something, I could like list myself as a contributor just because I submitted it.
Yeah, I don't think you would not be through the editorial process. You know, if your name doesn't show up somewhere as part of the metadata itself, or sorry, the resource itself, you probably would not be.
Okay, I mean, I'm just so that was one. Is the differentiation between those things clear?
Yeah.
The other thing is adding to. I don't know who it was that made the statement first, but it might make it easier if you have a lookup table of authors and contributors, and so therefore you can just like select and it'll autofill.
We do. So that's, let me show you. So for instance, boy, don't know where this is. Carl, it'd have to be, this is why we wanted this one. The combining, add them to the authors list.
And this is where at this point, behind the system, there is a list of combined names that show up as facets. But for the entry, right now we have you choose individual first and last names.
Right.
It's still a little clunky.
Yeah.
But
it needs to be alphabetized or something. I mean, yeah.
So I mean, it's just, So all right, thanks.
Yeah, but yeah, that's definitely. I mean, just to show you where that would show up. Let me get out of this for a second and just go back to. We didn't really look at authors when it came to search. But so authoring person names is where they show up together. It's a long list and it needs to be, if you figure out, what it's sorted by now is the number of contributions. So Amita Mehta has authored 19, Sarah Jones 15, Carl 9, that kind of thing. So, but there may be other ways that we want to enable sorting of this too. That's implied in your question, I think.
And another dimension of that contributors question is, this is a conversation we've been having in ESIP leadership for a number of years now, in terms of how ESIP as an organization and facilitator of communication and development of ideas and support for the community as those ideas then are infused more broadly into the practice of our organizations. There could be circumstances where ESIP could appear as a contributor to a product, as maybe the idea was seeded through an ESIP cluster before it then resulted in an organization producing a particular learning resource or a particular approach to developing that resource. So that's a potential place for being able to address that need, for being able to have more places to provide credit where credit is due for contributors to a resource that don't fit neatly into that authorship box.
Yeah, the research, I don't know how long you've been involved with ESIP, but there's a research object citation, I think it's still called that, right, Madison, cluster that's been talking about this issue for a couple of years. And I think there's a session, I forgot when it is, but about this whole question of contribution and authorship that you might be interested in attending too. That's a cluster that's been working.
I think there's one at the very end on.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, look, go ahead.
And the only other thing I might highlight, Nancy, while you're in the search page, if you maybe collapse the authoring person names, now that Nancy is logged in as an editor, you'll see that the search results by default are now much larger. There are 917 results because the editor by default has access to and visibility of the full range of published, in process, deprecated, in review of various types. And so we're leveraging the same search interface and using the authentication group membership to be able to provide access to the full range of resources or to being able to drill down. So Nancy, if you click on the publication status, this is one of the things that we wanted to do to enable hopefully more efficient work on the part of our community contributors is, if you wanted to focus, for example, on resources that are in pre-publication review, you can click on that facet and focus just on those 4 resources.
I'm curious.
And go in to edit them, look at their metadata, take action in the workflow options, all of those things as an editor privileged user.
Increasing the pressure and the power, responsibility. Yes, that number, we like it to be smaller.
Or maybe the number of published
There we go.
resources to be larger.
There we go. That's really what I meant, but okay.
Okay, so we've got just about 13 minutes left to close things up and hopefully give you a few minutes before we finish to complete our workshop survey. So I will grab the screen here and share mine. See if I can do this. Okay, so as we go into our closing information here. So this is a bunch of links that are also in the notes form, but we particularly wanted to highlight these first two here, the Clearinghouse feedback form. So if there's any additional feedback that you'd like to share with us related to the Clearinghouse, the functionality that you've seen, the glitches that you were encountered, areas for improvement or clarification, that Clearinghouse feedback form is a great venue for doing that, either now or also, maybe as you leave and play with it some more. We'd really appreciate any feedback you can provide. We also have this bit.ly for today's workshop. As we've been doing these for a while now, and we learn something new after every one of these workshops in terms of being able to try to improve how we're attempting to communicate this increasingly complex system and its capabilities and purpose in the universe. So we would absolutely appreciate your feedback on the workshop itself. As I highlighted in the beginning in the notes, and here again are the links to the 3 key GitHub repositories. The one for the backend application programming interface, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the Python code that is basically sitting on top of that data management tier with Solr in it. This is where the code is for that API. The user interface that's written in JavaScript using the Vue 3 framework. So if you're interested in, reaching into the guts of the system and playing with it, or have any suggestions, or just want to again highlight any issues that you've encountered and you're a GitHub aficionado, you could use GitHub issues to highlight areas for improvement in either the API or the user interface, and also the static content area. This is where we have essentially the markdown files that are being used to then populate the content on the home page, the about page, and soon the support page. So if you have any editorial feedback or would like to contribute a blog post, that's a repository where we manage that information. Our contact information is there on the right for reaching out to us directly. And we've mentioned a couple of times over the course of the workshop that, if you have some resources or you notice some resources that need some attention, you can use certainly the feedback forms, but those are somewhat ephemeral because as we reharvest the data from the production system into the development system, that feedback goes away. So in the long run, that will be a good mechanism. In the short run, that could result in that feedback kind of going into a temporary space where it would eventually be purged, possibly before we would act on it. So I would recommend using that clearinghouse@esapfed.org email address for providing us any guidance in terms of any resources that, as I said, need attention, or anything else related to the Clearinghouse for that matter. And with that,
There's one more slide.
Oh,
Yep, okay,
yep.
good.
And, as we've been going through this, there have been a number of occasions when we've highlighted yes, and that is something we need to do. This is someplace where we've tried to accumulate a number of those things just to let you know that, we still have a few more items on our punch list. One of the key things is that there already is actually the, code written for ORCID integration into the authentication system. And we're needing to transition our current authentication interface, specifically in the application right now, over to that ORCID authentication model, in which you can actually essentially create your own authenticated account through using the ORCID login model, which kills two birds with one stone. It helps us encourage the development and use of these persistent identifiers for ourselves, and it also streamlines the process for authentication and user management. We still have local users as well, and if you already have a user account through the existing ESIP Clearinghouse, or I think the users from the portal also come over with. So basically, if you already had an account in ESIP's web application space in the Commons or the Clearinghouse, you already have an account using those same credentials.
But as an authenticated user, I think, right? As an authenticated user.
Yeah. Well, actually, it comes in with whatever groups you have on the ESIP system.
Yeah.
As I got carried over as an administrator and all other things, and we didn't have to do anything to do that. So, but there are a number of paths. If you would like an account, just let us know, and we can set you up with one as well. There are a few metadata fields that remain outstanding that we need to integrate because they pose their own special individual issues. We're continuing to work on the static content pages and their content. And along with that, there's the homepage styling and content that's continuing to be worked on, and looking for other opportunities to work with the broader community for testing and evaluation, and continuing to sort of get feedback on what will be our release of the platform later this fall. As then we'll have essentially, we'll move over finally from the current Drupal-based system to this new platform, and the old system will go away. But we'll be continuing to seek feedback and start the new cycle of user assessment, user experience testing that ultimately led to the information that we used to scope this project. And because these platforms are constantly moving targets, and we also always want to be keeping abreast of what the emerging needs are in the community. So with that, the last thing we have is that question that came up at some point or several points in terms of how you as members of the ESIP community and the broader community of whether you're developing resources or you have expertise in particular areas, we're always looking for folks who can provide us insights in terms of our metadata model and search capabilities, how we can continue to evolve and manage that, helping us continue to think about assessment and how we integrate and evolve that capability within the system. As I said, we have sort of a powerful engine lurking under the hood that we're only leveraging small parts of right now. So we have a lot of opportunities, but we want to use that capability in an informed and efficient way so that we continue to maintain the usability of the system. We're always looking for folks to join the editorial team, for any of these roles that we've been talking about in terms of, submitters to help in completing the more complete metadata records, the reviewers for doing that first pass of looking at the metadata that have been produced, identifying holes or inconsistencies or errors that need to be cleaned up, and editors as well for helping us with the decision-making process for the final publication or deprecation of resources. And then we're always looking for new materials. If you've produced materials or you know of a cache of great learning materials that aren't in the system, please let us know, or when you are set up with an account on the system, go ahead and submit them yourself and get them into the queue for our analysis and processing. And the link here, this other bit.ly, is basically our Clearinghouse interest survey. So this is where you can provide just contact information and what you might be interested in contributing to the ongoing development and evolution of the Clearinghouse. And with that, I think we are done.
Unless there are any questions
to spare for once.
Questions or comments? Yeah. Thanks to everyone for all the contributions.
Any questions?
We'll take good luck wishes too.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you.